The Ritz-Carlton Millionaire Singapore glittered like a jewel box on the night of October 12th, 2019. Its ballroom transformed into a garden of white orchids and crystal that would have made even royalty envious. $3 million had been spent creating this fairy tale. Imported Dutch roses in shades of blush and ivory, a 12-tier wedding cake that required structural engineering, and a guest list of 500 that included cabinet ministers, business tycoons, and celebrities whose presence alone signaled the groom's significance in Singapore's stratified society. At the center of it all stood Marcus Tan, 42 years old, heir to a shipping fortune worth $180 million, beaming as his bride descended the staircase in a custom Vera Wang gown that cost more than most Singaporeans earned in 3 years. Angelica Rivera, 29, looked like every Cinderella fantasy come to life. Delicate beauty wrapped in silk and diamonds, tears of joy streaming down her face as she moved toward the man who'd promised her a life beyond anything she'd imagined possible. The 500 guests applauded, champagne flowed like water, and a live orchestra played while fireworks exploded over Marina Bay. No one knew that in exactly 6 hours, Marcus would discover the secret Angelica had hidden through their entire courtship. No one could predict that by sunrise, she would be dead, and Singapore's most lavish wedding would become its most notorious murder investigation. This is the story of how desperation, deception, and a disease shrouded in stigma converged in a hotel suite where love transformed into lethal rage. Angelica Marie Rivera was born on May 7, 1990, in Baguio City, a mountain resort town in the northern Philippines known for pine trees, cool climate, and a tourism economy that provided work for those fortunate enough to secure positions in hotels, restaurants, and service industries catering to Manila's wealthy escaping the lowlands' oppressive heat. Her father, Roberto Rivera, worked as a taxi driver, navigating the city's steep winding roads for 12-hour shifts that earned barely enough to support his family of 7. Her mother, Luz, supplemented their income through selling vegetables at the public market, waking at 3:00 a.m. daily to secure the best wholesale prices that would allow minimal profit margins. Angelica was the second of 5 children, positioned between an older brother who'd left for construction work in Saudi Arabia and 3 younger siblings whose education and basic needs consumed every pace the family could scrape together. Their home in the Locan area was modest but not destitute, a small concrete house with 2 bedrooms, intermittent running water, and electricity that functioned most of the time. They weren't suffering the extreme poverty of Manila's slums, but they lived perpetually on the edge where any emergency, illness, job loss, unexpected expense, could push them into crisis. Her childhood was defined by the kind of provincial stability that felt simultaneously secure and limiting. Baguio offered natural beauty, tight-knit communities, and relative safety compared to larger Philippine cities. But it also offered limited opportunities for advancement beyond service industry work that paid little and offered no real pathway to prosperity. Angelica attended public schools where overcrowded classrooms and overworked teachers were standard. Yet she managed to excel through natural intelligence, and the desperate motivation of someone who understood education was her only ticket beyond her parents' struggles. She was beautiful from an early age, possessing the kind of delicate features and graceful bearing that drew attention and compliments that made her parents both proud and protective. In Philippine culture, where beauty is openly discussed and celebrated, Angelica grew up hearing that her looks were her fortune, that she could marry well and escape the financial struggles that had defined her family for generations. It was both empowering and reductive. She had value, but that value was primarily aesthetic rather than intellectual or professional. At Baguio City National High School, Angelica excelled in English and developed ambitions beyond marriage as escape route. She dreamed of becoming a flight attendant, a profession that offered international travel, decent salary by Philippine standards, and the kind of glamorous lifestyle that seemed impossibly distant from vegetable markets and taxi driving. She studied tourism and hospitality management at the University of Baguio, working multiple part-time jobs to cover tuition her parents couldn't afford, determined to build a future through her own efforts rather than waiting for rescue through advantageous marriage. Her first serious relationship began in her sophomore year with Daniel Cordero, a fellow student studying business administration. He was handsome, ambitious, and from a slightly better economic background that suggested he might provide the stability Angelica's family had never achieved. Their relationship progressed from friendship to romance over 2 years, marked by the intense passion and future planning that characterized young love in a culture where marriage remained the expected goal of serious relationships. The relationship's end in early 2012, during Angelica's final year of university, would prove to be the defining trauma that shaped everything that followed. Daniel had been increasingly distant, making excuses about busy schedules and family obligations that didn't quite add up. When Angelica finally confronted him in March 2012, demanding honesty about his obvious withdrawal, Daniel's confession shattered her world in ways she couldn't have anticipated. He was sick. He'd been diagnosed with HIV 6 months earlier, likely contracted from a previous relationship or encounter he was too ashamed to detail. He'd been receiving treatment at a clinic in Manila, traveling there monthly for antiretroviral medications that controlled the virus but carried stigma he couldn't bear to share. And most devastatingly, Angelica needed to get tested immediately because they'd been sexually active throughout the period when he was infected but unaware of his status. The diagnosis came 2 weeks later, HIV-positive. At 21 years old, 3 months from university graduation, Angelica learned she was infected with a disease that carried social death sentences in Philippine society. The doctor's clinical explanation about treatment options and life expectancy barely registered through her shock and horror. HIV in the Philippines was wrapped in layers of stigma, misconception, and moral judgment that transformed a manageable chronic condition into a mark of shame. People believed it was a gay disease, a punishment for promiscuity, a death sentence that made infected individuals untouchable. Angelica told no one except her older brother Miguel, swearing him to secrecy and begging him to help her access treatment without their parents discovering the diagnosis. Miguel, working in Saudi Arabia, sent money for her to travel to Manila monthly for antiretroviral therapy at a clinic that guaranteed confidentiality. She created elaborate lies about the trips, job interviews, visits to friends, anything to explain her regular absences. The medication regimen was strict, pills taken at precise times daily, monitoring of viral loads every 3 months, side effects that included nausea and fatigue she attributed to stress. The psychological impact was more devastating than the physical reality. Angelica withdrew from friends, ended her relationship with Daniel despite his desperate apologies, and struggled with depression that made completing her degree feel almost impossible. She graduated in June 2012 with honors that felt meaningless, her dreams of flight attendant careers destroyed by the knowledge that mandatory health screenings would reveal her HIV status and disqualify her immediately. For 3 years, from 2012 to 2015, Angelica worked various service jobs in Baguio: hotel front desk, restaurant hostess, retail sales, positions that didn't require extensive medical examinations and paid enough to cover her medication costs while sending modest amounts home to her family. She was isolated emotionally, unable to pursue romantic relationships because disclosure meant rejection, unable to confide in friends or family because judgment seemed inevitable. The medication kept her viral load undetectable, meaning she was healthy and non-infectious according to medical science, but social stigma didn't follow scientific understanding. The decision to pursue work abroad came in late 2015, driven by the realization that remaining in Baguio meant accepting a life of limited prospects and perpetual secrecy. Singapore offered opportunities, higher wages, better healthcare system, and the anonymity of a large expatriate community where her past wouldn't follow her. The application process for service industry positions in Singapore was rigorous, including medical examinations that typically screened for HIV. But Angelica discovered through online forums that certain recruitment agencies focused on hospitality placements were less stringent, particularly for positions in retail and customer service, rather than healthcare or food handling. She secured employment through a boutique hotel chain seeking Filipino staff for their front desk and concierge services, a position that required basic health screening, but not the comprehensive testing demanded by hospitals or food service establishments. She provided documentation showing she was healthy, suppressing the reality of her condition through omission rather than outright falsification. It was deceptive, but she rationalized it as survival. The medication kept her healthy and non-infectious. So what harm was there in not volunteering information that would destroy opportunities she deserved based on actual job performance? Angelica arrived in Singapore in March 2016, at 25 years old, carrying her medical supplies hidden in her luggage, her HIV status known only to her brother Miguel and the Manila clinic, where she'd continue to receive care during annual trips home disguised as family visits. She rented a small room in Jailang with 3 other Filipino workers, found a rhythm of monthly medication management that colleagues mistook for birth control or vitamins, and began building a life in a city where efficiency and results mattered more than personal histories. Her beauty and professionalism quickly earned her promotions within the boutique hotel, advancing from front desk to concierge to eventually guest relations manager by 2018. She was excellent at her work, anticipating guests' needs, solving problems with grace, and projecting the kind of polished sophistication that made wealthy clients feel attended to rather than serviced. She was also desperately lonely, watching her co-workers date and marry, while she remained isolated by a secret that felt like a wall between herself and any possibility of genuine intimacy. Until Marcus Tan checked into her hotel in September 2018, and everything changed. Marcus Tan represented the apex of Singapore's business elite, third-generation wealth built on his grandfather's shipping company that had grown from a single cargo vessel in the 1960s to a fleet of container ships operating across Asia-Pacific. Born in 1977 to David and Catherine Tan, Marcus had grown up in the kind of wealth that normalized private education at Raffles Institution, university at the London School of Economics, and seamless transition into executive positions at Tan Shipping Group, where his surname was more qualification than any actual competence he might possess. At 42, Marcus was Vice President of Operations, a title that sounded impressive but functionally meant attending meetings where real decisions were made by professional managers, while family members collected generous salaries and maintained appearances of active involvement. His actual work week consisted of perhaps 15 hours of genuine labor, reviewing reports, approving decisions already made by subordinates, and representing the company at business dinners and social events where connections mattered more than contracts. His personal wealth was substantial independent of company holdings, property investments across Singapore, stock portfolios managed by private wealth advisors, and trust funds established by his grandfather that generated income requiring no effort beyond existing. He owned a penthouse in Orchard Road worth $8 million, drove a Bentley Continental GT, and belonged to exclusive clubs where membership fees exceeded what average Singaporeans earned annually. But Marcus was also profoundly lonely in ways that money couldn't solve. His previous marriage, to Stephanie Ko from an equally wealthy Chinese-Singaporean family, had ended in divorce in 2015 after 8 years marked by mutual ambition, but no genuine affection. They'd produced no children, a source of disappointment to both their families who expected heirs to carry on business dynasties. The divorce was amicable and expensive, with Stephanie receiving a settlement that cost Marcus $12 million, but freed him from a relationship that had always felt more like corporate merger than marriage. Post-divorce, Marcus dated within his social circle, corporate lawyers, bankers' daughters, socialites whose backgrounds matched his own. But these relationships felt performative, women who saw him as resume enhancement rather than person, who were attracted to his wealth rather than him. The isolation of extreme privilege became apparent. Everyone wanted something from him, access to his money or connections, making genuine connection feel impossible. His friends, noting his unhappiness, suggested what wealthy Singaporean men had been doing for generations. Consider a foreign bride. Southeast Asian women, particularly Filipinas, had reputations for being beautiful, family-oriented, grateful, and unburdened by the material expectations and career ambitions of local women who'd grown up with wealth. It was a reductive stereotype, but one that appealed to Marcus's romantic notions about finding someone who'd value him rather than just his bank account. The encounter with Angelica in September 2018 was chance rather than planned. Marcus was staying at her boutique hotel during renovations at his penthouse, a temporary arrangement he'd chosen for the property's discretion and personalized service. Angelica, as guest relations manager, was assigned to ensure his stay exceeded expectations. Their first conversation was professional, discussing his preferences for room temperature, pillow firmness, dietary restrictions. But Marcus found himself struck by her beauty and the genuine warmth that seemed to transcend typical service industry performance. Over his 2-week stay, their interactions deepened. Angelica recommended restaurants reflecting actual knowledge of cuisine rather than just tourist destinations. She conversed intelligently about literature, travel, and current events. She was respectful without being obsequious, professional without being distant. Marcus began finding excuses to extend conversations, asking her recommendations about Singapore's hidden gems, inquiring about her background with what seemed like genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When he checked out, Marcus did something uncharacteristic. He left his business card with a handwritten note asking if she'd be willing to show him some of the places she'd recommended, as a personal tour rather than professional duty. Angelica held the card for 3 days, torn between professional ethics, her secret health status, and the undeniable attraction she felt toward a man who seemed interested in her thoughts rather than just her appearance. She responded with a carefully worded text suggesting coffee, a safe, neutral meeting that could be framed as friendly rather than romantic. That first coffee led to dinner, then a weekend excursion to gardens by the bay, then increasingly frequent dates where their connection deepened beyond initial attraction into something that felt genuinely meaningful. Marcus was fascinated by Angelica's intelligence, her grace under what he recognized as financial pressure, her lack of calculation about his wealth. She seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts about business, his frustrated ambitions to prove himself beyond his family name, his loneliness despite material success. Angelica, for her part, found Marcus kind, thoughtful, and unpretentious despite his privilege. He treated service staff with respect, tipped generously, and seemed aware of his fortunate circumstances rather than entitled to them. The relationship progressed over 6 months, from late 2018 into early 2019, with increasing seriousness and intimacy. They navigated the class difference through Marcus's thoughtful attention to making Angelica comfortable, choosing restaurants where she wouldn't feel self-conscious, being sensitive about paying for activities without making her feel kept, introducing her gradually to his social circle rather than throwing her into situations where she'd be judged. The physical relationship developed slowly, with Angelica managing to delay sexual intimacy through various excuses: cultural conservatism, religious values, wanting to be certain of their relationship before taking that step. Marcus, charmed by what he interpreted as traditional values, respected her boundaries. What he didn't know was that Angelica was terrified of disclosure, of the moment when she'd have to reveal her HIV status and watch his affection transform into disgust or pity. By April 2019, Marcus was certain Angelica was the woman he wanted to marry. She represented everything his previous relationship lacked: warmth, genuine connection, appreciation rather than expectation. His family had concerns about the class difference, but Marcus's assertion that he'd found real love and his reminder that he was 42 and unlikely to find another relationship this meaningful eventually won their reluctant acceptance. The proposal came in May 2019 during a weekend trip to the Maldives where Marcus had arranged a private beach dinner under the stars. Angelica's tears were genuine as she accepted, her joy mixed with terror about the deception she was perpetuating. She told herself she'd disclose before the wedding, that she'd find the right moment to explain her condition and trust that Marcus's love would overcome initial shock. But the right moment never came. Marcus's excitement about wedding planning, his happiness in their relationship, his obvious pride in introducing her to business associates, all of it made disclosure feel impossible. She convinced herself that with her undetectable viral load, she wasn't putting him at risk. She rationalized that disclosing might end the relationship unnecessarily when modern medicine meant her condition was essentially manageable. She pushed the truth further into the future, telling herself she'd tell him after the wedding, after the honeymoon, someday when their relationship was secure enough to withstand the revelation. The wedding planning consumed 5 months, with Marcus insisting on a celebration that would announce his happiness to Singapore society. $3 million was allocated for what would become one of 2019's most lavish weddings. The Ritz-Carlton Millennia Ballroom, 500 guests, designer gown, and every detail orchestrated by Singapore's top wedding planners. Angelica's family flew in from Baguio, overwhelmed by wealth they'd never imagined, grateful for their daughter's incredible fortune. October 12, 2019, arrived with perfect weather and flawless execution. The ceremony was beautiful, the reception legendary, and as midnight approached and they retired to their honeymoon suite, Angelica's terror peaked. This was their wedding night. Intimacy was expected, and she could no longer avoid the truth she'd hidden through their entire relationship. The honeymoon suite at the Ritz-Carlton was itself worth more than most people's annual salary, a sprawling space of luxury with panoramic views of Marina Bay, champagne chilling in crystal buckets, rose petals scattered across a bed that could accommodate a family. Marcus was euphoric, loosening his tie and pulling Angelica into an embrace that spoke of celebration and anticipation. His wife, his beautiful wife, the beginning of their life together. Angelica pulled away gently, her hands shaking. "Marcus, we need to talk. I need to tell you something." The words that followed came in a rush, tears streaming as Angelica confessed everything. Her diagnosis in 2012, the medication she took daily, the undetectable viral load that meant she couldn't transmit the virus, the terror that had prevented her from disclosing earlier, and the desperate hope that he'd understand her situation and her deception. Marcus's expression cycled through confusion, shock, and something that looked like physical revulsion. He stepped backward as if her proximity was suddenly dangerous, his face draining of color. "You have AIDS." "HIV, not AIDS," Angelica corrected through tears. "With medication, the viral load is undetectable. I can't transmit it to you. We can have a normal life, normal intimacy. The science." "You lied to me," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "Through our entire relationship, you let me propose. You let me spend $3 million on a wedding. You let me introduce you to my family, my business associates. And you knew the entire time that you were infected." "I was afraid," Angelica sobbed. "I was terrified of losing you, but my condition is managed. I'm healthy. We can still have everything we planned." "Everything we planned." Marcus's voice climbed toward shouting. You think I'd have married you if I'd known? You think I'd have risked my health, my reputation? Do you have any idea what this does to me if this becomes known? That Marcus Tan married a woman with HIV. The cruelty of his response broke something in Angelica. I'm your wife. I love you. The condition doesn't change who I am. It changes everything, Marcus spat. It means you're a liar. It means everything about our relationship was fraudulent. It means you used me to escape your circumstances, to gain access to my wealth, to trick me into a marriage I never would have agreed to if I'd known the truth. That's not fair, Angelica said, anger breaking through her fear. I love you. I didn't marry you for your money. I married you because you made me feel valued and seen and you repaid that by putting my health at risk, Marcus interrupted. By lying on what I assume were medical documents, by committing fraud to secure a marriage that gave you instant wealth and status. I didn't put you at risk, Angelica insisted desperately. We haven't been physically intimate yet. You're not infected. We can get you tested to confirm, and then we can figure out how to move forward. There is no moving forward, Marcus said, his voice cold with finality. This marriage is over. I'll have it annulled on grounds of fraud. You'll sign whatever documents my lawyers prepare, return to your family, and disappear from my life. You can't just, Angelica started. I can do whatever I want, Marcus shouted. Do you understand what you've done? You've humiliated me in front of 500 people. You've made me a joke. Everyone will know that Marcus Tan was stupid enough to be tricked by a hotel employee with AIDS. Don't call it that, Angelica said quietly, and no one needs to know if you don't tell them. The implication hung in the air, that Marcus's reputation was in his own hands, that her condition could remain private if he chose discretion over public confrontation. But to Marcus, this felt like blackmail on top of deception, one more manipulation from a woman who'd already destroyed his trust. Get out, he said. Get out of this suite. Go back to wherever you came from. I'll have security remove you if necessary. Marcus, please, Angelica begged, her pride completely abandoned. I know I should have told you sooner. I know I made terrible mistakes, but I love you. Can't we try to work through this? Go to counseling. Learn about the condition together. Marcus's laugh was bitter and ugly. Work through this? You've defrauded me. You've exposed me to potential infection. You've destroyed my reputation. And you think we're going to counseling? He grabbed his phone, started dialing what Angelica assumed was hotel security or possibly his lawyer. Panic overtook her reason. She grabbed the phone from his hands, desperate to prevent him from making calls that would seal her fate. Marcus, shocked by her sudden aggression, grabbed her wrist with enough force to make her cry out. The physical struggle that followed was brief but violent. Marcus, enraged and feeling betrayed, shoved Angelica away from him with force that sent her stumbling backward. She tripped on the train of her wedding dress, falling toward the glass coffee table that served as the suite's centerpiece. The impact of her head against the table's edge was sickening, a crack that both of them heard, but only Marcus truly comprehended. Angelica crumpled to the floor, blood immediately pooling from the head wound. Marcus stood frozen, shock replacing rage as he watched his bride of 6 hours convulsing on the floor of their honeymoon suite. For crucial seconds, he did nothing, didn't call for help, didn't attempt first aid, simply stood paralyzed by the catastrophic turn of events. When he finally grabbed his phone and called emergency services, Angelica had stopped convulsing. By the time paramedics arrived at the suite 7 minutes later, she was unconscious and non-responsive. She was rushed to Singapore General Hospital's trauma unit, where emergency surgery attempted to relieve the bleeding in her brain caused by the impact with the coffee table. Angelica Rivera Tan died at 4:47 a.m. on October 13, 2019, 7 hours after becoming Marcus Tan's wife, never regaining consciousness from the traumatic brain injury that killed her. The doctors noted that the head wound was consistent with a fall against a hard surface. but the bruising on her wrist and the overall circumstances triggered mandatory police notification for potential domestic violence investigation. The Singapore Police Force's Serious Sexual Crime Branch took lead on the investigation, given the sensitive nature of allegations involving a prominent businessman and questions about what had occurred in the honeymoon suite. Senior Investigation Officer Linda Chen arrived at the hospital at 6:00 a.m., interviewing Marcus while forensic teams examined the hotel suite that had become a crime scene. Marcus's initial statement portrayed himself as the victim, a man who discovered his wife's HIV status on their wedding night, confronted her about the deception, and witnessed her accidental death when she'd become aggressive during their argument. He claimed she'd grabbed his phone, that he'd pushed her away in self-defense, that her fall was unintentional consequence of her own actions. He emphasized repeatedly that she'd defrauded him, put his health at risk, and destroyed his reputation through lies. But the forensic evidence painted a more complex picture. The bruising on Angelica's wrist was consistent with a forceful grip rather than incidental contact. The trajectory of her fall suggested she'd been pushed with considerable force rather than simply stumbling. Witnesses in adjacent suites reported hearing shouting and what sounded like furniture being moved or knocked over. The timeline between the altercation and Marcus's emergency call showed several minutes of delay that raised questions about his response to her injury. Most damning was the discovery of Angelica's personal belongings in the suite. Her medication bottles clearly labeled as antiretroviral therapy, her medical records from the Manila clinic detailing her HIV management, and a journal where she'd written extensively about her fear of disclosure and her plan to tell Marcus after the wedding. The journal entries revealed a woman terrified of losing the man she loved, not a calculating fraudster seeking to trap a wealthy man. The investigation expanded to examine Marcus's own actions and statements. Interviews with hotel staff revealed that Marcus had been drinking heavily at the reception, that his speech was slightly slurred when they'd retired to the suite, and that his judgment might have been impaired by alcohol. Friends who'd attended the wedding described Marcus as increasingly possessive during the courtship, occasionally making comments about finally having something that was really his, that suggested his attachment to Angelica was partially about ownership rather than partnership. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Angelica's death resulted from traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force impact with the glass table edge. While the fall could have been accidental, the force required to cause such severe injury suggested either a very hard push or a push that sent her from a position where she was already off balance. The presence of alcohol in Marcus's system at 0.08% blood alcohol content, over Singapore's legal limit for driving, was noted as potentially relevant to his judgment and impulse control. The HIV diagnosis became both central to understanding motive and complicated the public response to the case. Conservative voices argued that Angelica's deception was fraudulent and potentially criminal, that Marcus's anger was justified even if his physical response wasn't. Medical experts provided testimony about undetectable viral loads and the impossibility of transmission, information that challenged public misconceptions but struggled against deep-rooted stigma about HIV/AIDS. The Philippine embassy became involved, demanding justice for their citizen and protection for her family from media exploitation. Angelica's parents, devastated by their daughter's death and overwhelmed by the revelations about her condition, struggled to understand how their daughter's fairy tale had become a nightmare. Her brother Miguel provided testimony about Angelica's diagnosis, her years of secrecy, and her desperate hope that Marcus would accept her condition once he truly knew her. Marcus was charged with culpable homicide not amounting to murder, a charge that acknowledged his actions caused Angelica's death but didn't necessarily prove intent to kill. The prosecution argued that his forceful push, done in rage and possibly impaired by alcohol, was a criminally reckless action that directly caused her fatal injury. The defense countered that he'd acted in self-defense when Angelica became aggressive, that her death was a tragic accident rather than criminal act, and that her deception mitigated his culpability. The trial of Marcus Tan began in March 2020 and lasted 7 months, becoming a media sensation that exposed uncomfortable truths about class, disease stigma, and domestic violence. The prosecution presented a narrative of a wealthy man who'd felt deceived and humiliated, whose rage at losing control had led to violence, and whose privilege made him believe he'd face no consequences for his actions. Forensic experts testified about the force required to cause Angelica's injuries, suggesting the push was violent rather than defensive. Psychologists discussed the concept of perceived betrayal and how it triggered rage responses, particularly in men who viewed their partners as possessions rather than equals. Domestic violence advocates contextualized Marcus's behavior within patterns of intimate partner violence where perceived disrespect or challenge to authority escalated to physical force. The defense emphasized Angelica's deception as the triggering factor. She'd lied about her HIV status, potentially exposing Marcus to infection, and had committed fraud by omitting critical health information from marriage documents. They presented character witnesses who described Marcus as nonviolent and devastated by events. They argued that his push was reflexive self-defense when Angelica grabbed his phone, that he couldn't have predicted she'd fall in such a catastrophic way, and that her death was tragic accident rather than intentional harm. The HIV disclosure issue dominated public discourse. HIV advocacy organizations provided education about U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable, explaining that Angelica posed no infection risk to Marcus with her managed viral load. But stigma proved resilient. Many people continued to view her diagnosis as justification for Marcus's anger, if not his violence. The complexity of disclosure ethics in HIV-positive relationships, balancing medical privacy rights against partners' rights to informed consent, had no easy answers that satisfied everyone. Angelica's journal entries were read in court, her voice speaking from beyond death about her fears and hopes. "I know I should tell him. Every day I wake up planning to tell him, but the words won't come. What if he leaves? What if he sees me differently? I'm not my diagnosis. I'm healthy, I'm managing it, I'm not dangerous. But I know the stigma. I know what people think. Marcus makes me feel like I'm worth more than my past, more than my condition. I can't bear to lose that. I'll tell him after we're married, when he knows me well enough that the diagnosis doesn't define everything." The entries revealed a woman trapped between impossible choices: disclose and likely lose the relationship, or remain silent and risk the discovery that ultimately killed her. The prosecution argued this illustrated the impossible position that HIV stigma created, where people felt compelled to hide manageable medical conditions because social prejudice was more dangerous than the disease itself. The verdict came in October 2020, 1 year after Angelica's death. Marcus Tan was found guilty of culpable homicide not amounting to murder, a compromise verdict that acknowledged his actions caused Angelica's death while recognizing the complexity of circumstances. He was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment, a relatively light sentence that reflected the court's consideration of provocation factors while still holding him accountable for his violence. The civil case brought by Angelica's family sought damages for wrongful death, claiming that Marcus's violence had robbed them of their daughter and their granddaughter's mother figure. The case settled out of court for $2 million, funds that would support Angelica's parents and establish a foundation in her memory providing education about HIV stigma reduction. Marcus's business reputation was destroyed despite the relatively light criminal sentence. His family distanced themselves, he was removed from company leadership positions, and his social circle evaporated as former friends avoided association with the scandal. He served his sentence at Changi Prison, his wealth and status providing no special treatment in Singapore's egalitarian justice system. The broader impact of Angelica's death led to several significant changes. Singapore implemented more comprehensive HIV education programs in schools, emphasizing medical facts over moral judgments. Healthcare providers received training on supporting patients through disclosure conversations, recognizing that fear of rejection was a legitimate barrier to honesty. Domestic violence protocols were strengthened at luxury hotels, acknowledging that wealth didn't preclude abuse. The wedding industry faced uncomfortable questions about the pressure to create perfect fairy tales without acknowledging the human complexities underneath. The $3 million spent on Marcus and Angelica's wedding became a symbol of how material excess couldn't compensate for communication failures and secrets that poisoned relationships from within. Angelica's family returned to Baguio carrying her ashes and a complex legacy. Pride in their daughter's strength in managing her condition for years, grief at her tragic death, and anger at the social stigma that made her feel disclosure was more dangerous than silence. They used the settlement funds to establish a clinic providing free HIV testing and treatment in Baguio, a living memorial to their daughter that might prevent others from feeling they had to hide. Miguel Rivera, Angelica's brother who'd supported her through her diagnosis, became an advocate for HIV awareness in the Philippines. He spoke publicly about his sister's story, emphasizing that she was a woman who'd managed her condition responsibly, who'd fallen in love, and who'd been killed not by her disease but by a man's rage at feeling deceived. His advocacy helped shift some public perception from viewing Angelica as deceitful to understanding her as trapped by stigma that made honest disclosure feel impossible. The questions Angelica's death raises remain ethically complex. At what point in a relationship must HIV-positive individuals disclose their status? How do we balance medical privacy rights against partners' rights to make informed decisions about risk? What responsibility do we bear for creating social environments where disclosure feels safer than concealment? These questions don't have universally agreed-upon answers, but Angelica's death demands we grapple with them. 5 years after her death, Angelica Rivera Tan is remembered in the HIV community as a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of stigma. Her story is taught in medical ethics courses exploring disclosure obligations and patient rights. Her name appears on memorials recognizing people who died because social prejudice was more dangerous than their actual medical conditions. Marcus Tan was released from prison in 2028 after serving his full sentence with no early release. He emerged to a Singapore that had largely moved on from the scandal, though his name remained permanently associated with the case. He attempted to rebuild his life with limited success, his wealth intact but his reputation permanently damaged. He gave one interview in 2029, expressing regret for Angelica's death while maintaining that her deception had destroyed any possibility of their marriage succeeding. The Ritz-Carlton Millionaire continues to host lavish weddings, though the suite where Angelica died has been permanently removed from their honeymoon package offerings. Staff received training on recognizing signs of domestic violence and protocols for intervention when guests appear in distress. In Baguio, at the clinic bearing Angelica's name, her photograph hangs in the waiting room. A beautiful woman in her late 20s, smiling with genuine joy in a moment before fear and stigma shaped her choices. Below the photograph, a plaque reads, Angelica Marie Rivera, 1990-2019. Her life reminds us that silence kills, that stigma wounds, and that love requires truth even when truth is terrifying. May her memory inspire us to create a world where people living with HIV can disclose without fear of violence or rejection. May her death remind us that no amount of wealth or celebration can substitute for honest communication and compassion. And may we never forget that behind every medical diagnosis lives a human being deserving of dignity, respect, and the chance to love and be loved without concealing essential truths about themselves. The $3 million wedding that should have been the beginning of Angelica's fairy tale became instead her funeral, a tragic reminder that some secrets are too dangerous to keep. But that stigma makes keeping them feel safer than revelation. Her story demands we do better, for her memory, and for everyone else navigating the impossible space between privacy and honesty in relationships shadowed by disease and prejudice.